Because I have podcasts, and I write books, and I do audiobook exclusives. This was it's funny. I'll get a hold of a story and I'll say, where should this go? And I can almost figure out where it can go because I have podcasts. Is this a story that's heavy in forensics, a little bit of a mystery, but not quite a book? Then I'll put it on Buried Bones with Paul Holes, and we'll talk about it. If there's a really interesting story, I think the author is compelling, like an Eric Larson or David Gran, I'll put it on Wicked Words, where I interview authors like you do. But if it is a story like The Ghost Club, which is not quite a full-length book, but it is a story that warrants like 30,000 words. I mean, Putnam didn't quite know what to do with it. I remember one of the editors saying, do we publish like a pamphlet? Like, how does this go? This is not a book. And I don't think you publish anything. I think it's an audiobook only. And it's done so well. I mean, people love it. And part of that is my audience, because obviously I have podcasts that people listen to. I have three of them. And so my audience really is audio driven. And with the Ghost Club, it's a story about a group of men, starting with Charles Dickens, who started a dinner party club, social club, all male, who, they talk about world politics, they talk about their lives, and then, of course, they talk about like fairies and goblins and ghosts and try to prove whether someone is a credible medium. And it was a wonderful story to tell. And then I tell, of course, in that, the story of Harry Price, who was I think, self-proclaimed world's most famous ghost hunter, and his experience with living in the Borley Rectory, which was a very haunted manor house in England, and just sort of like, was he a fake? Who's a fake? Do you believe in ghosts? And are there really ghosts there? So that story, I loved Ghost Club. I wish I could have made it into a book, but I think it's an effective audio story. So I just have, sometimes you have to leave things where they are, where they're best. I
Oh,
keep going back. I don't know if that's ever going to change. I feel like I'm going to be in like the Iron Age here pretty soon. I keep going backwards because I start with 52 with the smog, and then 20s, late 20s and 30s with American Sherlock. And then Ghost Club is in the 1920s ish. And then you've got Ruloff, who is like 1872. Yeah, you're right. And then you've got Sarah Maria Cornell's story, the latest book, which is 1832 is when it really things start to happen. It's called The Sinners All Bow. And boy, I mean, I love all of my books, and I would not tell my editor this, but this is probably my favorite book. And I loved American Sherlock. Everything I've done, I think, gives me a lot more confidence as a writer, and I get so much out of the storytelling that I do in each of these books. But this is an important story. I am very female centric. I spend a massive amount of time writing about men killing women. I mean, statistically, that's just the way it goes. And I felt like I really wanted to write a story that I think influenced literature, and a story that was really important. It changed a little bit for me. So I'll just tell you the origin. The origin is that I had a listener email me and say, I want you to do the Haystack Murders on one of your shows. And I thought, okay. And I Googled it, and I found the story of Sarah Maria Cornell, who was a factory worker. She was 30 years old. She worked at various factories that were popping up in New England. This is the industrial age, Jacksonian America. And she was what a quote unquote factory girl. So she would move from factory to factory. She was found in December of 1980 of 18. She was found in December of 1832 on a farm, and she was in Tiverton, Rhode Island, which is now Fall River, Massachusetts, and she was dead hanging from a haystack pole. This was not the story that the reader intended for me to explore. This was they wanted me to go to Kansas. And I had run into this story instead. And I thought, this is an amazing story once I started reading about it, because it was so polarizing. She belonged to the Methodist Church. I mean, hold on to your hat, but the Methodists were wild in the 1800s. I mean, they were new. This was 50 years into them arriving, John Wesley coming, and there were like tent revivals and lots of alcohol, lots of sex, charming young men who were ministers with basically zero training. It was very evangelical, very passionate, and it frankly just infuriated the Congregationalists, the traditionalists, in the Protestant churches. And these were also the factory owners. And so when Sarah Cornell turns up dead, and we don't know yet if she's murdered or not murdered, when she turns up dead, the circumstances that come out pit the traditional Congregationalist churches with this newfangled religion of Methodism. And both churches, both groups had so much at stake with this case because it involved a Methodist minister. And I think that you've got these factory owners who are saying, parents are not going to send their girls to me because I can't protect them from these lascivious ministers. And then you've got the Methodist Church. They're literally protecting their ministers from being tarred and feathered. So there's so much that goes into it, but it is the case inspired, as you said, Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote the Scarlet Letter. So Hester Pryne, who is the main character in the Scarlet Letter, who is sort of demonized, ostracized, whatever you want, for being pregnant, is that story, without kind of ruining my book, that story works in such parallel with the Scarlet Letter. And Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote about Sarah Maria Cornell. It's very clear that this was his inspiration for this iconic character in one of the most famous books in history. And the other kind of odd part of my book, The Sinners All Bow, is that I'm kind of co-writing it with another author who has been dead for 150 years. There was a woman named Catherine Reed Arnold Williams, and she was a poet, and she read about what happened to Sarah Maria Cornell. And she was asked by a mysterious benefactor to please write a book that was just meant to totally dismantle this Methodist minister and Methodist, the whole church in general. And so she had access I didn't have. I had all of her notes, a book that she wrote, her own memoirs, private letters that she wrote. I got a hold of her family, and I used a lot of her material. But then I found out that she was sort of hiding some stuff and being inaccurate. Not inaccurate in her reporting, but she was conflating things to make Sarah Maria Cornell look like almost virginal, like martyred, which wasn't true. Things happened with Sarah Maria Cornell that were not great. She did make some mistakes. Being murdered and those circumstances were not one of them. But working with another author, I just started to think about biases and sort of why people are motivated to write things. So it's been a wild ride. I mean, this story, looking about the way other writers work and what their motivation is. And this is Me Too movement, and this is ultimately about a woman, a female, who is fighting for rights that are very important, and it got her killed one way or the other, whether you believe she was murdered or not. I think most people are under the impression I was under, which is sort of the first true crime book that we all know, Truman Capote, in cold blood, which bothers me because there's no endnotes. I don't know what his sources were. There's a whole host of issues with In Cold Blood, but it is a touchstone in true crime writing. Go back to Edmund Pearson, who really was, a really innovative true crime writer, probably 1910s, but there has not been another book because Catherine Williams wrote the first true crime book in America, and it was called, Fall River, a true narrative and a true authentic narrative. And that made this book very special. She was so highly motivated to write it. And what you saw before was almost like the Penny Dreadfuls in the UK, really kind of, it was either police blotter stuff or this is even before true detective stories. And, or it would be like really kind of like the Lizzie Borden type stories, but no books. So this was a pretty extraordinary book where she had some wonderful narrative writing, pulling the pieces together, just what I do. And her reporting was incredible. I mean, she had access to letters that no one had ever seen before from Sarah. It was just amazing. So I think, with that type of a story, looking at her book and incorporating everything that she did, I have to still look at it with a lot of skepticism. Like I would any material I work with, why is this happening? This doesn't seem right. Wait a second. I think she visited her doctor 4 times, not 2 times, like Catherine said. Why would Catherine conflate those, meeting times? Like I had to work overdrive, man. I mean, it was hard. Double checking myself and another author. It was difficult.